So hello, good morning to everyone. Welcome to Rio. Nice to see some familiar faces finally here again. So the presentation of today, well, before entering the presentation, let me first welcome everyone and thank particularly Nick, Astor, and Nicolo, and the FGV team, because everyone knows how stressful it is to organize a very complex, high-level event like this one, not only selecting very good people to bring here, but also the logistics of it. So thank you very much, Open Forum Europe, and thank you very much to everyone that traveled the world to be here. My presentation of today is, actually, I want to correct Nick as a good professor, because I didn't have really to add a layer of open source on it. Actually, as you will discover along the presentation, this is the result of pretty much 7 years of research, where actually open source periodically came up as a very important point of strategies of digital sovereignty that to some extent succeeded and to some extent failed. So my idea today is to share with you first a little bit of our research over the past 7 years, and secondly try to be a little bit critical to understand what have been success stories, and also what academics love also to identify miserable failures that should not be repeated, right? All right, so pretty much all the research I'm going to present today is available on this website. We are the only research center in the world that has a research project dedicated to analyzing digital policies in the BRICS grouping, which is quite interesting. Of course, we all know there are a lot of things that should not be replicated from the BRICS, but there are a lot of things that should be studied more to understand a little bit more also the dynamics, the geopolitical dynamics of technology that we have today, right? This is at least part of the team. You will recognize some of the people that are here in the room. We have a very large team consolidating all the fellows of the past 7 years. Again, it's not only the only research project dedicated to the BRICS digital policies, but the only research project that does this with people from the BRICS. So it's very interesting the kind of perspective we have, because it's literally the only research project that analyzes what happens in the BRICS through the perspective of people that live there and study there and work there, right? Good. So this is how we started to approach randomly, actually, by accident. It's a little bit of serendipity, like when Alexander Fleming was looking for the Staphylococcus and found the penicillin, we were looking for cybersecurity, and we found digital sovereignty. It was really how we started analyzing digital sovereignty 7 years ago. We were mapping how, in the first phase of the project that was dedicated to cybersecurity, how the BRICS regulate cybersecurity, and we end up understanding that there is an overlap between cybersecurity and digital sovereignty. Of course, they are not synonym, but there is a strong overlap. Cybersecurity is about understanding how systems work to identify potential vulnerabilities and mitigate the risks, ideally eliminate the risks. Digital sovereignty is about understanding the systems not only to reduce the risks, but also to leverage, understand the opportunities and leverage them for development, right? Again, there are a lot of different ways to define digital sovereignty, but what was interesting when we were starting to finalize the work 5 years ago is that at the same time we were mapping these initial narratives of digital sovereignty in the BRICS, and at the same time the European Union started to speak about digital sovereignty. My European friend here will recall that in exactly July 2020, 5 years ago, the first speech of President Ursula von der Leyen was about technological sovereignty. And so all of a sudden, something that previously was associated with authoritarian regime, digital cyber sovereignty or internet sovereignty, became something for democratic regime. The truth is that it's neither democratic nor authoritarian. It's a concept, and then we have to look behind the label to understand de facto if it is something that is used to empower people, to promote competition, to promote innovation, which is the good acception of it, or if it is something that is used to repress people and to surveil them and to stifle innovation, right? Which is also one of the exceptions, unfortunately. If you are interested in the Portuguese version of it, you can also freely download this book. Again, I'm sprinkling references along the presentation, so that if you are interested in particular parts of it, you can easily read about this. And then we started as a parallel track of research over the past 4 years, this project dedicated precisely to mapping the narratives, the initiatives of digital sovereignties in the BRICS. And this is where we started understanding that there was also a connection with open source technologies. This book also is, everything that I'm mentioning in the presentation is in open access, right? In free access. This is has been, actually, I was checking yesterday, has been downloaded almost 25,000 times over the past 11 months. So the ideas are quite spreading. And what is interesting here is that when we analyzed all these different manifestations and expressions of digital sovereignty, the first challenge was to define what was digital sovereignty. So through our empirical observation, but also through the analysis of what other people have used before as a definition, we elaborated this working definition. So the capacity to understand how the digital technologies work, develop them, and regulate them. And the purpose of this is to foster self-determination, control, and power over technologies. Now, this is very important. There is a very important point I'm particularly proud of, which is something that Nico has forgotten to mention, which is the developed part. Because previous research were very much concentrated in the control over technology, in the regulation, but no one had really very much focused on the development part, which is something that from a developing country perspective is the key part of it. Leveraging technology, not only to adopt a nice regulation, but to foster development in your country, because you need to develop. That is the purpose of being a developing country. You need to develop. If you are an already developed country, maybe you may focus more on the regulatory part, and you may forget that the development one is essential, but it is not something that you forget in a country where there are a lot of still underdeveloped areas. People need working opportunity, and you can still build new things, right? Which is something characteristically of not only of the typically global majority country, but for us in Brazil, and that is something that I was surprised to learn that very few people in the country know about, is in our constitution. So that is an enormous difference between Brazil and other countries when speaking about digital sovereignty. Technological strategic autonomy for technological sovereignty for us is not a theoretical concept. For us, being technologically autonomous is simply implementing the constitution that we have. And that is something that very few people understand, and to my greatest surprise, even in the government, very few people are aware about that. This is Article 219, so people usually read the first 10, 20 articles, and very few people reach the number 219, which is an explanation probably why very few people know about this. But for us, technological autonomy is a constitutional objective, right? Now, what is interesting here, and let me start connecting this with open source, is that few people also realize that Brazil has been a pioneer of digital sovereignty, because already 22 years ago, with the first Lula administration in 2003, Brazil adopted open source software in the federal administration. It was the first country in the world adopting open source software as a state policy. Now, what is interesting here is not only to learn from the fact that Brazil was a pioneer in this, but also that there was a sort of failure in it. For one simple reason, Brazil had adopted open source. So the policy was to adopt it, not to stimulate the development. And that is what countries like India or China have learned over the past 20 years. It is not only about adopting the technology, but also fostering, promoting, helping, supporting the development of it. And that is how you can leverage open source, not only for your digital sovereignty, but also as a strategic tool of regulation. See how DeepSeek models are released nowadays in supposedly sort of open source. See the digital public infrastructure strategies of India, which relies on open protocol, is not necessarily open source, but it is a tool of technological regulation. It's leveraging technology to regulate, right? Good. There are some very good examples of how then open source elements, at least, of technology can be leveraged for either for digital public infrastructures or for other specific tools, and I will bring a couple of examples, specific kind of technologies that on the one hand embed digital sovereignty, and on the other hand can be utilized as a tool of regulation, right? Digital public infrastructures in India, again, as I was mentioning, is not necessarily the best possible example because they rely upon some type of open source technology, but they also centralize a lot power on the one hand and technological control. Our experience with open source integration in PICS, which many of you may already know, is our digital public infrastructure for online payments. It's basically largely inspired from UPI, which is the Indian digital public infrastructure for payment. Very few people actually know that India was very much looking at Russia when developing UPI. The first country in the world that developed is domestic, autochthon DPI for payments was Russia, with the MIR system. So as a consequence of when they first invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea, the immediate sanction was blocking Russia from using Visa and MasterCard. And so they needed to develop a domestic system. That is something that the Indians looked at when they thought, well, actually they are the only ones in the world now, they are not dependent anymore on Visa and MasterCard. And everyone here knows not only that Visa and MasterCard charge 3 to 5% for all transactions, but they also consolidate all data that are collected. So the great let's say, decentralization effect of DPIs, at least in Brazil, was to decentralize totally the capacity to collect data, innovate based on those data, and generate value, and that value being taxed here, not in foreign jurisdiction with intellectual property being localized in tax haven that are usually dependencies of the British Crown. Now, a very interesting example that we also mentioned is community networks. I'm pretty sure that my friend Natalia will speak maybe about this. This is something we have dedicated a lot of research, is a very good example of actually crowdsourced infrastructures that are built by communities that are previously unconnected, and they build their own connectivity. They understand how the internet works. They are very wide. They are quite widespread in Brazil, in India, in South Africa, and the people themselves, therefore, they built the infrastructure. They understand how the technology works. They build the service that cater for the needs of the local population in local languages. That is precisely the definition of crowdsourced digital sovereignty, having literally people using open source technology, even building open hardware technology in order to cater to their own needs and create local digital ecosystems that are completely new and decentralized and correspond precisely to the need of the local population. So our research demonstrated that digital sovereignty is not only something for states, it's something also for individuals, for local communities. The capacity to understand, develop, and regulate according to your values, your needs, is something that everyone from micro to macro can and should enjoy, right? Good. Now, as I still have 5 or 6 minutes, let me just enter into another, 10 minutes, excellent. Let me also enter another element of our discussion that is quite useful for us, analyzing digital governance of data governance, if you want, in the BRICS countries. Something very interesting that we started to analyze 3 or 4 years ago is that there is a different approach, very different approach to data governance in developing countries compared with, for instance, Europe. The data is thought, well, we all have heard about data is the new oil, right? But very few countries actually orientate their own policies, their own data policies, to leverage the capacity of exploiting data for economic development as a state policy, right? Many countries may have policies about this, but very few countries do this in practice. That is something that is quite evident when we analyze how data governance is framed in developing countries, particularly when you look at China or India. Something that we have discussed in our research on data sovereignty is precisely the interesting of looking at data and what is known as informational self-determination, that we usually look at as a right, a fundamental right of the individual, also from a collective perspective, which means, again, being able to understand which kind of technology is used to harvest data, being able to develop it and to develop an alternative, not to be locked in the system that a foreign company is providing you, and regulate it according to your own values, including to share the value, the economic value it with the local population, which is something that is quite evident, again, when analyzing China. China considers data as a factor of production since 2019. Our friend there, Wei Wang, has written extensively for us about this here, and it is very interesting to understand, again, that leveraging open source technology is a tool to develop alternative system and not to be locked in system that will hoover all your data and will not give you back any of the value that is produced out of it, right? So what is, well, here the format clearly didn't follow my instruction, but for you to understand that what we distilled from our experience is precisely that you can regulate data or technology going beyond regulation. What does it mean? That the most interesting part of this approach that we have experimented and analyzed over the past 5 or 6 years is that law is essential. You know, Lessig was writing about this 30 years ago, right? You regulate not only through law, but also through architecture. He calls these markets, but actually I think it's not necessarily the best possible way of phrasing it, is incentives or taxation. And then social norms, right? But what happens here in developing countries is that you regulate much more if you invest or if you tax something rather than adopting a law. Because the law requires enforcement, which is very poor in developing countries. Pretty much the common thread of most developing countries is that enforcement is extremely poor. So if you think that your society, your economy will be regulated only through the law, we are doomed to fail. And I say this as a lawyer, right? So it is a moment of psychological therapy with collective sharing of anguish and failures of legislatory techniques over the past decades. Law is a highly imperfect tool of regulation. But if you invest in the research and development, so understanding the system, developing it, and directing industrial policy to leverage this in order to bake into the technology your values, including by leveraging open source technology. Because if you want digital environments to be open, the best bet that you have is to invest enormously in open source. That is a very interesting example, actually, that maybe, I'm not sure everyone here, well, the crowd here is quite acquainted with open source, but China, in the moment where Brazil started understanding the relevance of open source, also China started to understand this, exactly in the same moment. And then we can track what is the difference when you have a state policy of support of open source and the state policy that changes. And that is also an interesting finding of our research. Stability is essential if you want to foster open source, any kind of project, but particularly open source. You have to fund it in a stable and foreseeable way, right? So you have the governance of it, the financial governance of it is also very important and a highly understudied field. So what happened in Brazil is that at the very same moment where this, when Xilin was started 20 years ago, Brazil adopted open source. Then the problem is that Brazil only adopting it, open source was not seen as an opportunity for development, but only as a burden for public administration. And in 2017, the open source policy in Brazil was completely reverted, and we basically became subject of our Microsoft overlord that nowadays controls over all the digital public infrastructure in terms of infrastructure in Brazil. At the same time, 20 years ago, China started to invest in Xilin. And they are one of the very few countries nowadays that has an alternative open source system, an operative system that can be leveraged also to connect with the hardware that is developed in China. So they have leveraged over the past 20 years, not only research for technological independence, but research to develop systems that actually increment and expand the useful of the other elements of the digital stack that is developing China. And I will enter into this in a few moments. Now, the very important point here is also that this is mostly used in China by the government, by the military, and by state companies, which gives them a certain degree of resilience and of security that others may not have. So what the Chinese have understood over the past 20 years is that open source can not only be leveraged to promote innovation and development, but also for cybersecurity. And that is a very important lesson from it that other developing countries should look for. Developing together open source is not only about digital sovereignty in the sense of development. It's about digital sovereignty in the sense of cybersecurity. It's about not being locked in other countries' system. Now, in the 2 minutes that I have at my disposal, I'm just going to connect this with AI sovereignty, because everyone loves AI and it sells well at conferences. So we have been working a lot about AI sovereignty over the past couple of years. This was the first paper was published in 2023 about this. So if you want to also read the most recent research that we have, there is this book. If you don't have time to read the book, there is this paper. If you don't have time to read the paper, you don't need to ask ChatGPT to make the resume, because there is also a nice blog with all the key elements. And basically, this is the approach that we have been using over the past 3 years to understand and to analyze how BRICS countries are orientating the AI sovereignty policies and strategy and governance. Divide this into this element of the stack, right? Understanding how each of these elements is leveraged, is regulated in terms not only of law, but also of investments, initiatives aimed at research, development, and regulation, which are the 3 key pillars of digital sovereignty applied to AI. So all of these are what I call key elements, key enablers of AI sovereignty, right? It's pretty much evident why data is useful, software, computational capacity, meaning a lot of people underestimate the value of meaningful connectivity, and I'm going to show this, why this is relevant in the next slide. Electrical power. That's a very important point. It's the main reason why Brazil nowadays is highly relevant in the geopolitics of AI worldwide, because we have abundant clean energy. And why do we have abundant clean energy? It's not because we are particularly, well, maybe because we are particularly lucky because we have a lot of resources, but is the result of 5 decades of industrial policy, of research, development, and regulation in energy independence. The reason why nowadays Brazil is sovereign in energetic terms and attracts investment is because for 5 decades it has invested massively in industrial policy. And that is something I always explain to people in the government when they told me, well, but this is something that will require a lot of money and we are not able to do so because we are a developing country. It is false. There are a lot of very good examples of Brazilian excellence. See, energy, few people understand that Brazil exports planes. We build planes. Embraer, a public company, has been building planes over the past. We are the 3rd exporter of planes after Airbus and Boeing, because of 50 years of focused industrial policy. Embraer is going to launch next year flying taxis that are autonomous vehicles that fly. They are full of this is AI. It's basically, it's all robotics. So Brazil is already a champion of AI, but doesn't know it. That is something that the government itself should understand. Leveraging a little bit more the asset that we have, because we are already in a very good position, right? Cybersecurity and risk-based regulation, they are self-evident, but I'm a little bit frustrated that the discussion of AI over the past 5 years was only about risk-based regulation, which is essential, but not the only thing that we should look at, because it is useless to have nice laws on risk regulation if we forget about all the rest, and we should not understand the system and we cannot develop an alternative, right? Now, a quick reality check to understand how all this is interconnected, and if we fail to look at one of the enablers, even if we invest in the rest, we fail to be sovereign. I was very pleased last year when the Brazilian government introduced in our AI plan this concept of AI sovereignty that we have been working a lot, but also with regard to algorithmic and computational capacity, not with regard also to connectivity. Now, this is the problem of Brazil, which is a common problem in the global south except India. We do not have meaningful connectivity. We are all connected to meta platforms, to typically WhatsApp, sometimes Facebook, and sometimes Instagram. So people, the large majority of people in the global south is not connected to the internet. The statistics about connectivity are totally biased because they do not, they are quantitative statistics, not qualitative statistics. Most people in the global south is only connected to meta family of apps, which is what happens in Brazil. 78% of the population does not have open internet. They have subsidized, zero-rated social media, and all the rest is extremely expensive. Again, market dynamics. If you create artificial scarcity, making the open internet very expensive, while you subsidize only 3 apps, then it's obvious that you will orientate people's attention and their data and their capacity to train your AI system, because coincidentally, Meta AI is pretty much the only AI that most Brazilians have access to. And they are training with their own personal data, and they are being trained. Again, what Lessig told us, that creating habits is one of the best ways to regulate technology. If you train people to have access only to Meta AI on their daily basis, they will think that Meta AI is the only AI. So it's totally useless to invest billions, as Brazil is doing, in computational capacity, in algorithmic capacity. Is 80% of the population will only have access to Meta AI, which is the reason why the others are starting to zero-rate their own services. OpenAI has announced last month that they are zero-rating ChatGPT. Perplexity is zero-rating Perplexity to compete, because the market players understand that if you do not do this, you cannot compete in the market, which is quite the opposite of an open internet, which is actually explicitly enshrined in our Marco Civil Internet, our civil rights framework. So again, this is very evident, very solid evidence that law by itself is necessary but not sufficient. We have to look to understand how the technology works, and we have to be able to develop an alternative, not only regulating it. We should follow actually India's example in this. India in 2016 prohibited zero-rating, and that is to me the greatest untold story of India's digital transformation and India's digital sovereignty. They have been experiencing a belle epoque of innovation over the past 10 years, precisely because they prohibited these practices. And so you can access and you can share any kind of innovation you want. There are a lot of things that can be criticized about India, but I think this is one of the best policies that should be copied by others. Some data here from our researcher, Smriti Parshia, that analyzed from the Indian regulator reports, there has been an explosion in connectivity and a massive decrease in the price of the megabyte in India, as a result of prohibiting these practices. Why? Because if you cannot access only subsidized applications, you will access everything, and you will also be able to share everything. And if we want to foster open creativity and open innovation, we have to start from open connectivity. Thank you very much for your attention.